The rule of law is mortal, right? It can be killed. It is wounded when the people involved in the judicial system and the adjudication of alleged crimes are being threatened and harassed and intimidated and pressured out of their jobs for doing that work. Today, Justice Juan Merchan in New York said jail is what is coming next if Trump continues to disobey court orders. And do you think he's going to continue to disobey these court orders? I mean, Justice Merchan today said, quote, "I worry about the people who would have to execute that sanction, the court officers, the correction officers, the Secret Service detail, among others. I worry about them and about what would go into executing such a sanction. Of course, I'm also aware of the broader implications of such a sanction, but at the end of the day, I have a job to do. Your continued violations of this court's lawful order threaten to interfere with the administration of justice, constant attacks which constitute a direct attack on the rule of law. I cannot allow that to continue. As much as I don't want to impose a jail sanction, and I've done everything I can to avoid doing so, I want you to understand that I will. I will do it if I have to. Your direct attack on the rule of law cannot be allowed to continue." Just a signal moment in American history today. And it's sort of clearer to me on this day, at this moment, than it's ever been in my lifetime, that the rule of law isn't just a bumper sticker, right? It isn't an abstract thing. It doesn't float in like a miasma and suffuse the atmosphere. The rule of law is specific stuff in a day-to-day way. It means, for example, that court orders must be obeyed. And if you don't obey them, the court will punish you for that. It means, for another example, that people who are part of the judicial system, judges, court personnel, juries, witnesses, defense lawyers, prosecutors, it means they're also able to do their work without being threatened or intimidated or being harassed or fired by people who are associated with the accused. That's law and order, right? That's the rule of law. That's a nuts and bolts concrete thing. And it is under intense, incredible pressure. It is having trouble right now in our country because as the judge in Trump's first criminal trial is trying to stand up for the rule of law today, as he said in this warning to Trump, right? This cross the Rubicon moment in court today where he warned Trump he really is making plans to jail him if he keeps violating the court's order. While that is happening, simultaneously, the Republican-controlled Senate in the state of Georgia is moving forward on what appears to be their plans to subpoena the prosecutor who's leading the criminal case against Trump in the state of Georgia. District Attorney Fani Willis is leading that prosecution. As soon as she opened that investigation, the Republican-led legislature in Georgia started moving to try to curtail her authority, to give themselves the ability to fire her as a prosecutor. That process has been weaving and wending through legal obstacles for months now. But now they are planning to haul the prosecutor, to haul Fani Willis into the state Senate and force her to turn over evidence and testify herself under oath while she continues to try to lead that prosecution. Meanwhile, simultaneously on Capitol Hill, we've now got the Republican chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jim Jordan, launching apparently some kind of new investigation into one of the assistant district attorneys who was in court today leading the prosecution of Trump in his New York case. Meanwhile, simultaneously, this weekend, the former president hosted a high-dollar fundraiser at his home in Florida, in which he, unbidden, brought up the federal prosecutor who's overseeing his classified documents Espionage Act prosecution in Florida, and also his overthrow the government case in Washington, D.C. According to a recording of those proceedings reviewed by NBC News, Trump said at this fundraiser, quote, "Deranged Jack Smith, one of the sickest prosecutors in the world, the sick, evil thug. Take a look at the deranged. And he's perfect because you look at him. He's not attractive both inside and out. I mean, you couldn't get a better guy if you're trying to make the devil that deranged. Yes, this is one unattractive dude. That's why," and then the former president reportedly said, "frickin' expletive." So that was Saturday afternoon. That was not long after he had posted this in all caps online on his social media company, quote, "Arrest deranged Jack Smith. He is a criminal." Again, the rule of law is not an abstract feeling or sense of being. It's not something you just proclaim to be true and then set it and forget it, right? Terrorizing judges and juries and witnesses and prosecutors is something that breaks the rule of law. If those people are intimidated and harassed and threatened, the rule of law has been broken. This past Friday, a California man was criminally charged with making death threats against Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. A few weeks ago, a man in New York was charged with threatening New York's Attorney General, Tish James, and Judge Arthur Engoron, who was overseeing the civil case brought against Trump's business by New York Attorney General Tish James. In February, a woman from Texas was sentenced to 3 years in prison for threatening the judge overseeing Trump's classified documents case in Florida. Not long before that, a different Texas woman was charged with threatening the judge who's overseeing Trump's other federal criminal case, the overthrow the government case in federal court in Washington. Not long before that, the FBI fatally shot a man who had threatened to kill the New York District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, who has brought the case that's currently being argued in criminal court in New York. Right. This stuff has consequences, and this stuff is consequences. We are not looking at some vague future threat to the rule of law. What you're seeing here is actively and currently damaging the rule of law right now, because people are intimidated and terrorized. People who work in the legal system as these alleged crimes are adjudicated there are being harassed, threatened with firing, and intimidated and threatened. And it is happening in all the criminal cases that surround Trump. Right? You might remember this lead in a recent special report from Reuters. Quote, District Judge Royce Lamberth has been threatened by angry criminals, drug cartels, even Al-Qaeda. But nothing, Lamberth says, prepared him for the wave of harassment after he began hearing cases against supporters of former President Donald Trump who attacked the U.S. Capitol in a bid to overturn the 2020 election. Lamberth, who was appointed to the bench by Republican President Ronald Reagan, was painted by right-wing websites as part of a deep state conspiracy to destroy Trump and his followers. Calls for his execution cropped up on pro-Trump websites. Quote, traitors get ropes, said one. After he issued a prison sentence to one Idaho woman who pled guilty to joining the January 6th riot, Lamberth's Chambers voicemail filled with death threats. One man found Lamberth's home phone number and called repeatedly with graphic vows to murder him. Lamberth told Reuters, quote, I could not believe how many death threats I got. This is, again, not some future potential threat to the rule of law. This is damage to the rule of law, and it is here already. When participating in the adjudication of alleged crimes by a political figure and his followers bring you death threats, the rule of law has been bent. The rule of law has been broken. Those harms to the rule of law, that damage to the rule of law, has been inflicted already. The prospect of jail for the Republican Party's active presidential nominee, that is here already. He got his face-to-face warning in court today in New York. One more violation of the court's order banning him from speaking about the jury or witnesses in his case, and he will be put in jail with Secret Service detail. That time is now here, which means we are about to find out what it's like to be a country that has a presidential candidate and former president in jail because he refuses to follow court orders. It's not a thought experiment anymore. It's not the future. It is here. Are we ready? And so what do we do about that? One way to start dealing with that is to stop pretending that it's not happening. Threats to the rule of law are not a theoretical prospect looming sometime in the future. They are here. Prosecutors and judges and jurors and witnesses need defending right now. Right now, because they're being threatened right now. Who, for example, who is defending Fani Willis in Georgia right now? The Republican-led legislature in Georgia is trying to destroy her and remove her in order to stop her from prosecuting the alleged crimes of former President Donald Trump. Who is defending her?